All right, so what we're going to talk about today is climate zones in Africa. Now, when we talk about climate zones in Africa, it's important that you understand Africa is such a huge continent. There are many, many different climate zones. These are just some of the general ones that we will talk about. Most of these climate zones are in what we call the tropical climate zones or the low latitude zones. So these low latitude climate zones that are located near the equator, they're typically going to have a pretty warm climate. They are typically going to be located between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. In most of these climates, it's warm year-round. The only time you really find snow in these latitude zones is going to be when you're at an extremely high altitude. So low latitude, high altitude. Most of the people in this climate zone can't do anything for a living except subsistence farming. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but mostly it's just because of the intense heat and the incredible population centers that are here. You don't find a lot of people in these climate zones that do anything other than subsistence farming because they just aren't very productive. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but ultimately it's just that they are too warm and they aren't very productive for crops. That's why a climate like Iowa's is much better for growing crops because the climate zone itself is so much more conducive for it. So the first climate zone we're going to talk about is the idea of the rainforest climate. So the rainforest climate is located between 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south of the equator. This is going to be found in the Amazon rainforest, in Central Africa, in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, in Indonesia, all of which are located near or on the equator. Obviously, it's going to be hot, humid, moist here. You're going to have extremely large populations located nearby, and you're going to have heavily forested areas. Really, the products that are going to be grown here are cash crops. What are cash crops? Rice, rubber, sugar, bananas. Okay, so these are just some examples of different kinds of cash crops. There are lots of different kinds of cash crops, and you need to understand that cash crops are a very relative term. In today's world, the idea of a cash crop is really the idea of any agricultural crop at all. Because the cash crop of the world today is going to be anything that you raise primarily to sell. Most farmers today that grow corn, that grow beans, they raise them to sell them. So they're really cash crop farmers. But we tend to refer to those as subsistence crops because you can also grow those simply for yourself. So a lot of the products that we see that are grown here in the rainforest, rice, rubber, sugar, bananas, those are things that are going to be cash crops that are there, because yes, you can raise rice, yes, you can raise rubber or sugar or bananas for yourself, but you're going to raise those things primarily in this climate as a cash crop. I'm going to grow rice so that I can sell it. I'm going to grow rubber trees so that I can strip the bark and sell the rubber. I'm going to grow sugar, I'm going to grow bananas so that I can sell those. You're not typically going to find cash crops as being things that you can eat and survive on. Of course, rice is kind of in that same realm as corn and beans in today's world, but you're not going to eat sugar. You're not going to have, a tobacco salad. You're not going to be eating bananas for every single meal. Because the advantage of like corn and beans and rice, so you can feed those to animals. You can feed those to cows, pigs, goats, etc., and then you can eat the cows, pigs, goats, you can drink their milk, you can survive off of them, so they're much more diverse than just something that you would consume. Primarily this is going to include the Congo River and the Ivory Coast, and primarily the rivers here are the main mode of transportation, because any other mode of transportation has such a negative impact on the environment, but also because it has such a negative impact on the physiogeography. The more rainforest you cut down, the less it rains. And so there's a lot of problems with that. I'm not sure that this is going to work, so I want to make sure. Yep, okay, we're good. All right, so we're going to keep going then with this. So we've got our rainforest climate. So now we're going to move a little further away from the equator. So in your mind, you need to be moving away from the equator with all of these climate zones. So between the rainforest and the deserts. The deserts are going to be at the extremes of Africa, the Sahara in the north, the Kalahari in the south. The deserts that are located in Africa are going to be the extremely dry. We've gone from the extremely wet, we're working our way into a drier climate. So as we talk about the savanna climate of Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking in that 10 to 20 degrees north of the equator. So now we're getting further away from the equator. We're getting into areas where we have more grasslands. There's not as many trees because water is not as plentiful. And the reason water is not as plentiful is primarily because of the monsoon climate that is located here. Now, if you recall from our last unit on Japan, we talked about the idea of a monsoon. A monsoon simply means a seasonal wind. The seasonal wind means that sometimes when the wind blows out of the north or south, it brings with it dry air from the desert. Sometimes when the wind blows out of the other direction, out of the north, it will bring with it wet moisture, wet air, and thus it will rain. So in a climate like the savanna, you will have 6 months where it will rain. It doesn't rain every day, but it will rain during 6 months. And you have 6 months when there is no chance of rain, 0% chance of rain for 6 months. So what happens in those 6 months is crops die, animals die, humans die. So it's really important because sometimes in some calendar years you get 4 months of rain and 8 months of dry. Well, that's really disastrous because there's not enough rain in the years when there's when there's not enough rain, and so then that means by the end of the dry season, animals are dying right and left. By contrast, if it rains too much, you get flooding because the ground is not ready for that much moisture. So it's really a fine line that you have to balance in the savanna climate. Typically, the only crops you find here in the savanna climate are going to be subsistence crops. And you don't find a lot of people living in a savanna climate. People want consistency. We've talked about that before, that people want to have a consistent rainfall. They want to have a consistent governmental structure. They want to have a consistent political system. They want to have a consistent whatever it is. They want consistency. And a savanna climate is just too inconsistent to maintain a large population base. Therefore, we don't find a large population. You will find dense populations of animals at certain times of the year because of the rainfall. So when it's very wet and there's lots of grass growing, you'll find lots of zebras, and thus the animals that live off of zebras. When it's very dry, you'll find animals that are better off in a dry climate. Maybe this is where you'll find your elk, and you'll find your other animals that will come through. So in that sense, you will find dense populations of animals, but not dense populations of people in those scenarios. So now we're going to move further away from the desert. So if you look down here in this bottom right-hand corner, you see we're getting further and further from the idea. Whoa. Sorry about that. We're getting further and further from the idea of being by the equator. The equator runs right about here. The savanna is located about here. Now we're into the Sahel. So the Sahel is what they call the shore of the desert. So this is where your quote-unquote wet areas of the savanna will come in contact with the dry areas of the desert. And this is the shore, if you will. So this is the land between high rainfall areas and the arid zones of Africa. Rainfall is variable. It's like the savanna, in that you're not going to get a lot of rain here consistently. But the difference is, say in the savanna, you might get 30 or 40 inches of rain in a year. In a Sahel, you're going to get 15 inches of rain a year. It's still more than a desert, but it's not enough to maintain any kind of real agricultural lifestyle. So most of the people that are here are nomads. They move from source to water to source of water. Now remember, when we talk about the nomadic lifestyle, nomads are not wanderers. Nomads move with a purpose. They follow food sources, or they follow water, or they follow traditional migratory patterns. And so when we talk about the idea of agriculture in the Sahel, there really is no farming per se in the Sahel, just because it is so dry. And one of the things that is really a problem in the Sahel is this idea of desertification. And desertification is simply a growing desert, meaning the desert is growing outside of its boundaries. And since the Sahel is the shore of the desert, it's going to grow outside of its boundaries here, and it's going to continue to grow outside of its boundaries and continue to grow outside of its boundaries. And the problem is that as the Sahel grows, it expands. The Sahel is a relatively new phenomenon geographically, meaning that the Sahel only goes back a few, tens of thousands of years, because The Sahara used to be an ocean, and the Sahel was the dry areas by the ocean. Well, then the ocean dried up for a number of geographical reasons, and now the Sahel is what's left of these dry areas that were outside of the ocean. So the Sahel is, again, this transition from the extremely wet rainforest to the somewhat wet savanna to the dry Sahel, which of course leads to the very dry desert. The problem is that the Sahel throughout most of Africa is growing. And as the Sahel grows, it shrinks down the savanna because it puts more and more of the savanna into a Sahel. So what happens is the desert expands into the Sahel expands into the Savannah expands into the rainforest because we're cutting down the rainforest so that we can use it for trees and build roads and try to industrialize those parts of Africa. And there's just all kinds of problems that go with that. So desertification is really, it's not necessarily a new concept in Africa, but it's very problematic problem in many parts of the countries that border the deserts of Africa, particularly the Sahara, but certainly it's a problem in the Kalahari down in southern Africa as well. All right, I gotta see where we're at here for time. Okay, got about 4 more minutes. I think I can do the desert here then. All right, so let's talk about the tropical desert. 20, 30 degrees north or south of the equator. Hot, no rain. Now understand, a tropical desert is different than a continental desert. And we'll talk about this second semester when we get into Russia and we talk about the idea of a continental desert. A continental desert is more of the kind of desert you would find in the United States or that you would find in Russia, in Europe. In the further you get from the equator, the more it is what we call a continental desert rather than a tropical desert. They're both hot, they're both dry. You know, the difference between a tropical desert and a continental desert in terms of the amount of moisture is almost non-existent. Neither one of them get much. Obviously, there's not very many people there. The biggest difference between a tropical desert and a continental desert is that a tropical desert is primarily a sand desert, and a continental desert is primarily a rocky desert. So if anybody has been to Arizona, New Mexico, that area of the United States, very, very dry. It's very much a desert, but it's more of a continental desert. Now, the only reason it's continental and this is tropical, the fundamental difference is that it's seasonal, meaning they have winter in Arizona. You know, winter means it gets down into the 50s. In the tropical deserts, winter it gets down into the 60s or 70s. That's the low temperatures. So it's a little bit different in that sense because you've got such dramatic temperature variations that are going to happen there. Certainly we're not going to find a lot of people there. Virtually no vegetation, moisture, no products. The only people we find living in the tropical desert are going to be nomads, and very few of them actually live in the desert. They typically will pass through the desert. And of course the Sahara is the largest tropical desert in the world. There are other tropical deserts. The Sahara is certainly the largest. Kalahari is also a tropical desert. Most of Australia is actually what we would call a continental desert because it is seasonal. They do get some rain there, just not much. I think I'm going to stop here because I'm going to run out of time pretty quick. But so in these low latitude zones, that's really where we run into some unique issues. I'm going to stop there and then we'll start